Today I'm going to show you guys how to drift all-wheel drive cars in GTA 5. So this video is entirely dedicated to showing you guys how to drift in all-wheel drive cars. First, we're going to recap some main skills and controls that you'll be using, and then we'll move into specific instructions for performing the mid-drive speed boost, additional tips and tricks for both low and high-speed drifts, as well as a final all-wheel drive drifting demo that puts all of these skills into play. Now, even though I will be providing a brief overview of the main skills and controls that we'll be using, keep in mind that all-wheel drive drifting is a very advanced drifting tactic, and if you aren't familiar with the basics of drifting rear-wheel drive cars first, then I get comfortable with those. Feel free to check out my in-depth 3-part drifting tutorial if anything in this guide doesn't make sense to you, or if you want a more full understanding of drifting in GTA 5. With all of that covered, let's get started. Alright boys, so first off, going through the main controls, we've got our left pointer finger here over the left trigger to use the brakes. To engage the mid-drive speed boost in all-wheel drive cars, we will need to tap both the normal brakes and the handbrakes simultaneously. Additionally, we will use the brakes to help pull some angle out of our drifts for those high-angle drifts and entries. Next up, we've got our left thumb here on the left stick to steer and counter steer as necessary so we can enter drifts and keep our car sideways to a line. Moving on, we have our right thumb on the right stick to help reposition the camera. As you guys will see in the controller camera gameplay, I will pull back on the stick slightly and aim it in the direction of my drift so I can help plan out my lines and get better proximity to obstacles. Next up, we've got our right pointer finger here over the right bumper for the handbrake. We will utilize this a lot to control our car's power, to engage the mid-drive speed boost, to lock up the rear wheels to get our car rotating quickly for a drift, and also to keep our car's revs up when we're extending a drift. Finally, we have our right middle finger over the right trigger to control the throttle. Typically, we'll keep this floored to ensure we're using as much of the car's power as we can, but we can always modulate it a little bit to help control our car's angle and prevent it from spinning out. So with these main controls in mind, let's quickly cover how to build an all-wheel drive car for drifting. Generally speaking, an all-wheel drive drift car will be pretty much the same as a rear-wheel drive drift build, which will simplify things quite a lot. Now for the sake of this guide, I will be using the Declasse Drift Tampa as it's one of the best all-wheel drive drift cars in the game, but I do have a video that does cover some awesome all-wheel drive drift cars if you want to take a look at that. Either way, once you've chosen your car, let's quickly head to the LS car meet so we can equip all the upgrades that we'll need. Once there, we're going to apply the following upgrades. First off, we're going to max out the engine. Next up, we're going to leave those brakes stock. Next up, for the spoiler, we're going to leave it off or just leave it to whatever the default option is. Next up, for the suspension, we're going to lower it as much as possible. Next up, we're going to max out the transmission. We'll also do the turbo tuning to add a little bit more power. And then finally, in the wheels section, we will equip low grip tires. Now, once we head outside of the LS car meet and onto the track, we're going to stance our car. For the Declasse Drift Tampa here, we're going to have to do this manually using a weapon. Now, if this basic tune doesn't work for you, feel free to check out my in-depth drift building guide for a more in-depth explanation of stancing and further fine-tuning your car so you can find the absolute perfect drifting setup. And that's really about it for some basic controls and a simple all-wheel drive drift tune. With all of that covered, let's head to the track. Alright, so to get started, before we even try to engage that mid-drive speed boost, we're first going to do some pulls in a straight line so we can get familiar with how our car shifts up through the gears. When we're actually ready to attempt to engage the boost, we're going to launch our car softly and build up speed, again making sure to listen to the point where the car would shift from second to third gear. Towards the top of second gear, we're going to let off the throttle, and then we're going to quickly tap both the handbrake and the normal brakes, and then we'll slam right back on the throttle. Now the mechanics of engaging the mid-drive speed boost are very similar to how we do it in rear-wheel drive cars, but obviously in all-wheel drive cars there's the extra step of using the normal brakes in addition to the handbrake, so that way we can limit the speed of all 4 wheels, not just the rear ones. The mid-drive speed boost will feel and sound very similar to how it does in a rear-wheel drive car, except this time the power boost and the wheel spin may not be as noticeable because all-wheel drive cars tend to have a bit more grip. However, you should still feel a slight boost in speed, and the car will obviously go to redline, 2 indicators that you've done the boost correctly. Now, one thing to note here is that the time you take to tap the handbrake and the normal brakes will affect the repeatability of the mid-drive speed boost. Typically, all-wheel drive cars will accelerate harder than rear-wheel drive cars, so to account for that and to ensure the car doesn't upshift into third gear when you try to engage the boost, you'll actually need to hold down the handbrake and the normal brakes a little bit longer than you would in a rear-wheel drive car to make sure that you can actually kick the transmission down a gear and properly engage that boost. This actually will take some time on your part to figure out how long the duration of that combined handbrake and brake tap needs to be. Now, generally speaking, the mechanics of repeating the mid-drive speed boost during those longer and higher speed drifts is very similar. You're going to ride out the boost as long as possible, and then you're going to let off the throttle to allow the wheel speed to drop and attempt to engage the boost again. And you'll also try to engage the boost either right before or right after your transition so you can get the car sliding in the direction that you want. Just as we talked about with doing the mid-drive speed boost in rear-wheel drive cars, keeping your speed up is crucial for being able to consistently repeat the mid-drive speed boost. When engaging this boost in all-wheel drive cars, the combined use of the brake and the handbrake will cause the revs to drop very quickly, so you will need to pay more attention to your revs and ensure they're actually high enough to try engaging the boost again. If you don't pay attention to that, very oftentimes your car will bog down and fall out of power and ultimately kill your drift. So hopefully at this point you're comfortable with the mid-drive speed boost in all-wheel drive cars and you can consistently repeat it in a straight line. So now you're ready to actually start attempting basic all-wheel drive drifts. Luckily enough, this process is very similar to rear-wheel drive cars, as the basics of entries and planning out your lines are pretty much the same. However, I would recommend starting slower, sticking to those lower speed first gear drifts like donuts and figure eights, and then once you're more comfortable with those, try out higher speed lines and work in the mid-drive speed boost when you're comfortable. This is a complicated process and in my opinion will take some more time for you to get familiar with than rear-wheel drive cars, but I do have a few tips that should help you in this process. First off, be aware that a lot of all-wheel drive cars do have a tendency to straighten out, since the power that's going to the front wheels will serve to pull the car out of a drift and prevent any oversteer from happening. Depending on how much grip your all-wheel drive car has will affect how much work you'll need to put into both counter steering and power control to keep a drift going. Some cars that have more grip and more power going to the front wheels will require you to steer a lot more in the direction of the drift and utilize the handbrake to keep the car sideways without gripping up. Other cars that lack grip and have more power going to the rear wheels will feel a bit more natural, and counter steering with those cars will feel similar to how they do in a proper rear wheel drive drift car. No matter what all wheel drive car you choose to drift, lower speed drifts will feel a bit different than how they do with rear wheel drive cars. The concepts of counter steering and power control will still apply, but you might need to use these tactics more or less depending on the car that you're drifting. As I mentioned beforehand, some cars like the Drift Champa that I'm showing will feel a bit smoother, and other cars may require a lot more work to drift properly. One thing to think about here is that in these lower speed drifts, sometimes the front wheels are losing grip too, and this overall lack of grip can be a bit confusing the first time you experience it. Because the front wheels are still getting power but they're also losing grip, the front of the car will be understeering, while the power going to the rear wheels and the lack of grip there will force the car to be oversteering. This difference in grip between the front and back wheels means that your donuts and lower speed drifts will swing the car out a bit wider than it would in a rear wheel drive car, again because those front wheels are losing traction. I know that sounded a bit confusing, but trust me, you will probably feel this very quickly when you try to drift an all-wheel drive car for the first time. However, your existing knowledge of car control and the tools that we've learned up to this point should help you get used to this pretty quickly. Now, for higher speed all-wheel drive drifts, the basic concepts that we covered regarding entries and planning out your lines will operate pretty similarly, and with enough practice you should be also able to work in the mid-drive speed boost to those drifts as well. However, keep in mind that the overall increased grip of an all-wheel drive car can make very high speed drifts a bit harder, and you might find yourself transitioning a bit more often so you can just keep those slides going. The speed limit that you can hold a drift at in an all-wheel drive car is a little bit lower than it is in a rear-wheel drive car, so just keep that in mind. The last thing I will say here is that not every all-wheel drive car is worth trying to drift with, as the power distribution that goes to the front wheels in a lot of cars can make it very hard to consistently hold out a drift without a lot of work. If you want to pursue all-wheel drive drifting further, I would highly recommend using the Drift Champa that I mentioned towards the start of this section, or you can try out any of the other cars that I feature in my best all-wheel drive cars video. With that all covered, here's some footage of me doing some all-wheel drive drifting to summarize everything I've covered up to this point. So hopefully that serves as a really good summary of the basics behind all-wheel drive drifting, and with enough practice you'll be able to hold out decently long drift and use the mid-drive speed boost to keep things going. Again, this style of drifting is much harder, but it is super rewarding and is definitely a good way to hone all of the skills that I've taught you guys up to this point. And that's a wrap for this quick guide covering all-wheel drive drifting in GTA 5. Hopefully this guide helps you guys out. If you have any more questions, then don't hesitate to leave them in the comments. With all that said, thank you guys so much for watching and supporting my channel, and have an amazing day.